Political pundits don't often make the best fiction writers, but it hasn't stopped many of them from trying. And one of the most prolific of those pundit-turned-writers has been Glenn Beck. He's written thrillers for adults, children's stories, and now he's taking a crack at a book for young adults. This one is titled Chasing Embers. This book came to my attention after reading a story on how Moms for Liberty, a right-wing conservative activist group, was raising money to get it put into public schools. If you're not familiar with Moms for Liberty, they've worked tirelessly to get books banned in schools across the United States, particularly those discussing race and LGBT issues. They've also encouraged schools to instead include books such as the Tuttle Twins series and other children's titles written from a conservative perspective. Chasing Embers aims a little higher up in its age range than those books, though, instead targeting the young adult demographic, hoping to stand alongside such classics as The Giver and more modern hits such as The Hunger Games. While Chasing Embers has spent a few weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, apparently from legitimate sales rather than mass purchases, it hasn't quite reached the heights of these beloved classics. But this is just the first book in what is supposed to be a series of 6, and it might get a leg up if the Moms for Liberty group have their way. So I thought it would be interesting to give this title a read and see what kind of message Glenn Beck is trying to deliver to the youth of America. Before starting, I want to make a few things clear. Unlike some of Glenn Beck's other fiction efforts, this book was written with Michaela G. Hedrick, who works for Beck's production company, Mercury Radio Arts, which is within the larger Blaze Media company. It's a bit difficult to parse out who's responsible for what in this book, but from what I could gather, the world and general premise came from Beck, while the actual text was written by Hedrick. I'm not too sure who came up with the specific characters or plot, but they seem happy to share credit for the book itself. Chasing Embers is a dystopia set in what used to be the United States of America. In the introduction, we meet our first POV character, Ember, and yeah, that is her name. She's 9 years old and living with her parents and younger brother Henry in a home in a fictional town called Oasis. This giant urban area is controlled by a corporation called Topos. Oasis isn't terribly well defined as a location, but according to Beck, it's inspired by the idea of 15-minute cities.
It's a dystopian tale where, the 15-minute cities have happened and everybody lives in these dystopian kind of communities.
I'm not sure Glenn Beck understands the idea of an efficient city that structures essential services in an accessible distribution. I guess in his mind it's code for living in Airstrip 1 from 1984. Ember's parents are surreptitiously recording history into a special book while teaching that same history to their children. In this future, books have been banned, and learning this history is forbidden. What immediately leapt to my mind at this point was Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, about a future where books are forbidden and a handful of resistance folks fight back by memorizing the great works of history. Chasing Embers is, in a way, about the same thing, except not as good. It's very interesting how the blurbs in the back never mention this obvious connection and instead make allusions to other works such as 1984 and The Hunger Games, probably because they don't want this book to seem like it's ripping off a very famous book about a dystopia. But a big difference between Chasing Embers and Fahrenheit 451 is the kind of books and kind of history that the narrative treats like contraband. As the prologue moves along, some goons show up to take away Ember's parents, while she and her brother hide in the closet, holding the book their parents had been working on that possesses some of that forbidden knowledge. Ember's parents are part of a resistance group called the Oarsmen, and the goons are moving through Oasis, making mass arrests of members of this particular group. As Ember's parents are being dragged away, they start shouting out some of this forbidden knowledge, which gives us an example of what's forbidden in this future. Here's an excerpt from the book. In an impulsive act of rebellion, as the couple was dragged away from their unit, the husband began asserting facts from the past. We were the first nation to land a man on the moon. We became an independent nation in 1776. Our first president was George Washington, then Adams, then his wife joined him, Jefferson. They spoke together, overlapping each other's sentences. In 1492, Columbus, endowed by our Creator, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. One by one, every oarsman within earshot, all the others being taken away from their units, began to shout at the same time. The shot heard round the "Give me liberty, Allied powers, September 11th, 2001, and we dropped the atomic free speech, free press, free religion, free assembly, free on the seventh day by the content of their character. The truth will set you free." Looking at those various excerpts from history tells you about this book's perspective. It is very American-centric, but as some of those later quotes also reveal, it's very Christian-centric as well. It initially made me think we'd be getting some Christian nationalism in this book, and while there is some of that, what this is also demonstrating is the simplicity of how history is understood in this book. The Oarsmen are preserving a very specific segment of history, the stuff that venerates an American and Christian tradition. This dichotomy raises the interesting question of who chooses what history is and is not preserved, and what it means that the rebel group in this oppressor-oppressed dynamic only seem to care about a specific type of history, and as we'll later learn, a specific reading of that history. There are a few small exceptions later in the book, but these are very much in the minority. And even when we find them, they still relate to the general American or Christian traditions. The first chapter of the series keeps us with Ember, but now she's 7 years older. She's 16 while her brother Henry is 7. She's still living in Oasis, but instead of being with her parents, she's with a caretaker named Mrs. Grisham. I guess the Topos goons found them at some point and put them in someone else's charge, though they didn't find the history book Ember's parents were putting together because Ember still secretly possesses that. Ember at 16 feels a bit off. Admittedly, I don't spend much time with teenagers, but she reads to me much younger, as if she were actually 12 or 13, and this is true for many of the early chapters of the book. Really, she only seems to act her age much deeper into the second half, when there's this romance subplot that seems to come out of nowhere. It makes me suspect there was a change at some point, but earlier parts of the book hadn't been reworked to reflect that change, because when you see Ember in these early chapters, she's very bratty and frequently trying to mess with her guardian, Mrs. Grisham, the sort of thing that you wouldn't necessarily expect a 16-year-old to do. And also when she's invited to Building 1, she sounds like a child going to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. Building 1, by the way, is this giant structure in the center of Oasis. It's sort of like the nerve center for the town. It's where the administrator works. He's the big boss of Oasis, more or less Big Brother. Except whereas Big Brother was a vague idea of authoritarianism, the administrator is very much a real guy. He doesn't make many physical appearances in this book. Instead, Ember has to interact with Azaz Ilo, the administrator's right-hand woman. And as you might have noticed, characters we're supposed to give special attention to have names like Azaz Ilo, a name the book assures us is very unforgettable, but it was one I had to look up several times when writing my notes because, honestly, I kept forgetting it. We learn from Azaz Ilo that Ember has a promising future. We don't really know why at this point, though. The chapter ends with Ember discovering her forbidden book was confiscated, and it might compromise that promising future, whatever it's supposed to be. Chapter 2 introduces us to the other main character of this book, a 17-year-old boy going by Sky. He's recently escaped Oasis and is running through the wilderness outside it. What his life was before he left is going to be a mystery for most of this book, because even though it's told in first-person narration, so we have access to Sky's thoughts throughout his many chapters, for some reason he just never thinks about the stuff that would actually tell us who he is and why he's running away from Oasis. It's actually kind of annoying. Right now, the only hint we have as to why he's left is that he's having visions of William Tyndale and remembering vague moments where his mother is saying everything is lies. His mother's words mostly remain a cipher throughout this book, but to give you some insight into William Tyndale, he was a 16th century English scholar who translated much of the Bible into English. He was influenced by Martin Luther and the Protestant movement, and one of the few examples of non-American-centric history that comes up in this book. And naturally, it's a direct connection to Christianity. Why Sky is having visions of him, we don't really know yet, but apparently it's what helped convince him to leave Oasis. While in the wilderness, Sky happens to run into a guy named Mr. Amos, who I suspect is a self-insert for Glenn Beck, or if it was his co-author's idea, she wanted to put her boss in the book. This weird dude loves talking about history and performing it for others. His tedious sense of humor and overly hokey persona reminds me of Glenn Beck doing stand-up. And yes, we now have to watch a clip of that. Sorry in advance.
Us conservatives, we've never gone out and done these things, you know? We're not the kind that goes out in the street. We don't organize like that. We've got jobs.
Amos lives in a small community called Cherry Harbor, and it's there we learn more about the Oarsmen. This small community of 30 or so houses, at least according to the map in the book, is filled with people choosing to live outside Oasis. And many of these people have a reverence for the Oarsmen, and may secretly be members themselves. Having been raised in Oasis, Sky knows nothing of these outsiders but the scaremongering propaganda he's been told. But gradually, as you might expect, he learns to trust them. Being friendly with the Oarsmen codes them very clearly on the side of the resistance. The Oarsmen motto is taken from the preface to Tyndale's translation of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which is the Old Testament in the Christian Bible. Here's the excerpt. Laid plainly before their eyes in their mother tongue, or else whatever truth is taught to them, these enemies of all truth quench it again. Considering William Tyndale was about bringing the previously obscured words of the Bible into a language that people could more easily understand, it's easy to see how it maps onto the mission of the Oarsmen who are trying to preserve knowledge so that it might be passed down to future generations. It's just very heavily religiously coded. Back with Ember, we find out her promising future is with a group that was created by Topos called T.R.U.E, which is an acronym standing for Tenets for the Reduction of Underage Extremism. And now we know that Topos believes in torture because they're doing it with the English language to get that acronym to work. Believe it or not, there's another acronym that's significantly worse than this one. T.R.U.E is basically a group of young people who inform on any friends who make subversive comments by placing trackers in their pockets so some goons can show up to arrest them, drugging them and putting them into a coma. Very strong Hitler Youth vibes with this group. Ember is thrilled to be joining these kids because she's really into Oasis. I'm not sure how she didn't put together that the goons who took away her parents when she was 9 are the same ones in charge of the city, but that's part of why I think she's meant to be a bit younger. By the way, that forbidden book that I mentioned was confiscated doesn't come up again for a while. Mrs. Grisham lied about where the book came from, and I guess the Topos goons decided we're not going to pursue this matter any further, which is weirdly lenient for a totalitarian regime. We get a sense of Ember being under the thrall of Azaz Ilo, who is comically villainous. At first, she seemed like this more seductive villain who was slowly going to convince Ember to follow her lead, but Ember is head over heels for this woman immediately, so much so that this villain actually becomes kind of boring. To get a sense of what she's like as a character, here's part of her speech to Ember. These books, we believe, are the reason for a sudden spike in social unrest. We've had more young people carrying out impulsive acts, becoming violent, becoming nasty, even. She goes on from there about the need for social control, and it's not at all convincing, at least not to this reader. And seeing Ember go along with it just makes her seem foolish. It alienates her from the reader in these chapters, but not in a way that I would call interesting. She doesn't have to be convinced or coerced into tagging children to be taken away. She's glamored before she even steps inside Building 1, in spite of her parents being literally disappeared in the middle of the night. Back with Sky, because the book is constantly going back and forth between these two characters, we're introduced to more residents of Cherry Harbor. One of the first ones we meet is part of Amos's history lessons. Since Sky is new to Cherry Harbor, he has to sit in with the first years who are all significantly younger than him. One kid is introduced like this. The boy speaking was like a full-grown man trapped in the body of a scrawny child. His short-sleeved checkered dress shirt was tucked perfectly into jeans. His dark brown eyes looked like they belonged to someone old and wise, but his spaghetti arms gave away that he was just a dorky kid waiting to get punched. This kid's name is Lincoln Freeman, and for fans of heavy-handed naming, this isn't anywhere near the worst one. Sky is a bully to Lincoln at first, and since Sky is 17 and Lincoln is 12, it looks really bad on him. And much like Ember, in these early chapters, Sky is a very unlikable protagonist. It feels like a chore to read a lot of his chapters. Here's how Amos gives us a lesson about World War II. Hitler was consumed by hate. That's what you need to know about him. He hated God, he hated humanity, he even hated himself, but he channeled that hate onto one group of people, the Jews. We needed someone who could stop him, someone who could infiltrate his inner circle, a spy. From here we get the story of Raoul Wallenberg, as the guy who stopped Hitler. And while Wallenberg was a great guy who saved the lives of many Jewish people, it would be a stretch to call him the guy who stopped Hitler. What matters, though, in these lessons is that they are parables for the kids who can then apply them to their everyday lives. As Amos's lecture continues, Lincoln, who never lies, is conflicted when he finds out Wallenberg told lies to save the lives of Jewish people during World War II. For those unfamiliar with the history, he forged various documents to save a number of Jewish people from being sent to concentration camps. When Amos is confronted about the moral question of whether or not it's okay to lie to save someone's life, he answers like this. The answer is that sometimes in life, the bad things are all mixed up with the good things, and it's very hard to separate them out. But we must try. Wallenberg wasn't lying for his own gain. He was lying to save lives. Heaven knows that's different, and heaven knows why. That's where I would direct this question if I were you. Heaven isn't the only one who knows why, because this is not a difficult moral equation. Lying to save someone's life is not a tough decision. To present this as a philosophical problem for a 12-year-old seems almost insulting. But what this answer really emphasizes is that rules and morality are seen as something divinely ordained. Heaven knows why is not a phrase chosen lightly, appealing not to some sort of rational process where human beings can figure out which decisions will be more ethical than others. Instead, it's about understanding and comprehending some sort of divinely inspired morality and why it's important to be obedient to that religious authority, something we'll see more and more as the story goes along. Also, one other note for this section is that Skye calls Lincoln a teak, which is some kind of slur. We never find out what it means, but Amos gets so angry about it that he nearly kicks Skye's ass over this, so I imagine it's really bad. Back with Ember, we see her taking very well to her new life as a junior fascist. She also calls people teaks, so I guess she's a racist too. In the first sign that she has any kind of talent, she is congratulated by Azaz Ilo for her excellent progress within the group, and that she might be elevated in the near future. At this point, she's informed on 4 other kids. We don't really know how any of the other informers are doing, but it sounds like the others just really suck at ratting out their friends if nabbing 4 people is an incredible feat. Ember does eventually think about how she's targeting kids who read stories like the ones her parents told her about. But because Ember is very unaware of herself, she simply notes the coincidence for the reader and then moves on. I'm genuinely more interested to know how she was just so completely brainwashed in those intervening 7 years, but that's not what this book is about. Back with Skye, we get another history lesson about communists as really bad people that had to be defeated in the space race. Again, no real detail in the story, just something you would get from reading Conservapedia. This section does raise some questions about the history that's presented, because it's all real-world history in this book that we, as the readers, are presumed to be aware of. But none of the lessons Amos teaches are ever about the recent history of this fictional world. Like, how did America turn into whatever it is now? We only have this tiny little piece of Oasis, and we don't get much more than a vague idea of what's happening. That there was some kind of war going on, and that Oasis was built as a response. If the Oarsmen are the keepers of the real history, it seems as though the history of Oasis would be the one that would be most important to know, and the one people would be most interested in learning. I understand the book is trying to keep certain mysteries about the series alive, so it doesn't want to share everything right away, but then it just raises the question of why would you even have these history classes that are revealing what is forbidden knowledge without actually going into the forbidden knowledge that might be interesting to the reader. As you might expect, Skye and Lincoln eventually form a friendship as Skye begins to feel like he has a new home with a loving family he's always wanted because the people of Cherry Harbor are just so wholesome and pleasant that he can't help but be charmed by their very heavily coded American small-town community. So in the light of all this love and knowledge he's attaining, he decides he has to run away. This plot twist has 2 very big problems that make it fall completely flat, at least for me. The first obvious problem is we have no idea why Skye is doing this, or why he's doing anything really. He was motivated by visions of a ghost and a vague sense of his mother saying things were all lies, but aside from those early moments, we're given no additional information on why he's doing what he's doing. And the only thing we've learned about him as a character is that he's a very obnoxious teen who bullies kids and really just wants a family to love him. There's stuff we learn later in the book, but at this point it's just kind of annoying because the story just feels as if it's withholding this information as some kind of cheap gimmick, because all we would need as the readers is for Skye to take a moment to reflect on his recent history. But much like the recent history of Oasis, this is just not something the book wants to talk about. The second problem to this plot twist is related to the family love that Skye finds so alluring. The domestic life that charms Skye reads like a book written in the 1960s, complete with whitewashed history lessons and a honeyed idealism of a Norman Rockwell painting. But rather than examining those ideals for what they were, created in a specific moment in time, this story presents them as something more eternal, something Skye wasn't raised to appreciate, but rather feels deep inside himself. And it speaks to the relationship this book has with the truth. In the world of Chasing Embers, this vision of American suburban bliss isn't considered a construction cooked up by ad men on Madison Avenue. Rather, it's presented as some kind of deep, essential truth, a vision of happiness that is inherent to the human experience. So when Skye is accepted into this space, it's a process of forgetting everything he used to be and getting in touch with some kind of inner voice that tells him he wants to live in this world, where salvation looks like an episode of Leave It to Beaver. None of this is to say that the world of the happy family home is something no one would want. Of course, there are people who would like something like that, and it's perfectly fine to want that kind of life. But when you take a character like Skye, who has no knowledge of this cliche, who responds to it as if it's some kind of essential truth, as if every human being deep down really just wants to live in this manufactured version of 1960s America, it really speaks to how limited the perspective and the message of this book is. It's not getting at any sort of deep truth inside of us. Rather, it's presenting to us a very specific version of a happy American life. But let's go back to Ember. While trying to tag another kid, Ember runs into a mysterious man talking about the various stories in her parents' book. And when he sees Ember, he mysteriously knows her name. He runs off and leads Ember on a chase to a secret underground tunnel where she loses him but finds Oarsmen propaganda scrolled all over the walls. Although it wasn't revealed until several chapters later, at least to me it was plainly obvious that this mystery man was Ember's father, Adam Aronson. While it's understandable that Ember might not recognize her father after 7 years, and knowing someone's name and secret Oarsmen propaganda isn't a perfect giveaway, in the context of the story, the only adult man who could have even known Ember, a random girl living in Oasis, is her father, and all that Oarsmen propaganda basically seals it. I suppose it's possible this also could have been a new character, but if that were the case, his identity wouldn't need to be so mysterious. As a reader who's read a few books, the telegraphing of this plot twist was way too obvious, and it now becomes very annoying over the next couple of chapters waiting for Ember to figure it out. In the Oarsmen secret tunnel, Ember meets Azaz, and Azaz tells her that they keep the tunnel like that because they're trying to understand the Oarsmen. She then pressures Ember into turning on her brother because they reveal that they never believed that story about the forbidden book being something they just kind of found, and someone has to be punished for it. Later at her home, Ember does actually place a tracking device on her brother, but she has a change of heart when she sees the goons arrive to inject Henry with Teal Lady, which is this special teal fluid that they eject into people to put them into comas. It's only at this point that Ember has a change of heart and rescues her brother in a ridiculous action sequence where she fights off 2 Topos agents. Here's how it reads. I was able to escape Mrs. Grisham's grasp as the fat agent's syringe pierced Henry's skin. His body froze up as he wailed in pain and horror. Lunging for the agent's belts, I yanked out 2 syringes, and before they could stop me, I jabbed the syringes into their backs. They too became paralyzed and screamed. I had to wait about 30 seconds for the teal liquid to empty out into their bloodstreams. Then they collapsed onto the ground. This little sequence read ludicrously to me. It made me wonder how inept these security agents were if they could be taken out so easily by a random 16-year-old girl. It makes me wonder how frail Ember's parents were if they couldn't fight off guys like this. It also suggests that there is some degree of incompetence at Topos at play, which then raises the question as to how they managed to control this entire town when their goons are so easily dispatched. Following this throwdown, Ember escapes Oasis with an ill Henry, and on the way out, they run into Skye, who was heading back to Oasis. Ember and Sky meet at the halfway point in the book, and seeing Henry being in need, Sky decides to give up on that sudden urge to run away from Cherry Harbor and heads back with Ember and Henry to find medical attention, almost as if him running away was a necessary plot twist to get Ember to Cherry Harbor. In the meantime, we get another history lesson from Amos to Sky, this one perhaps being the strongest example of how history is bastardized in this book. The story is a bit too long to include in its entirety, but here's an abbreviated excerpt starting from when a sea captain captured some people 4 centuries ago. The captain lured in a dozen or so men, they called them Indians, and captured them. He wanted to sail them to a country across the sea and sell them into slavery, but a group of monks rescued as many of them as they could by buying them and setting them free, including a man named Squanto. Squanto lived across the world with complete strangers for many years, and even though he wasn't one of them, he lived among them and learned English. But he missed his family, so he decided to go home. He didn't know it, but while he was gone, a horrible disease came and killed everyone. Everyone he knew was dead when he got back. He had no one, and he belonged nowhere. Years later, new people arrived. They wanted to live on the land Squanto was raised on, but it was winter and they were starving, and they had no homes yet. Half of them died. Probably they all would have died if it weren't for Squanto. Other people wanted to help the newcomers, but they didn't speak the same language. No one spoke English except for Squanto, and Squanto knew the land. He'd been raised on it. He told the new people where to plant food and where to fish. Without him, they all would have died. No one else could have helped but Squanto. He had to speak English, which he only knew because he had been sold into slavery. He had to know the land, which he only knew because he had been raised on it. But he also had to be alive, which he wouldn't have been if he hadn't been taken from his people. Squanto could have seen his whole life as a tragedy. He had every reason to quit, to despair, but he didn't. He took his struggles and did something good with it. He saved all those people. Before breaking down the story, just as a note, I'm going to be using the name Tisquantum rather than Squanto, because Tisquantum was the man's actual name. Now, the reason I read so much of that story is because the details are the most important part. The story focuses on Tisquantum, avoiding the names of the various colonizers who invaded his land. The captain, monks, and settlers are all disparate entities that seemingly have no connection to one another or the greater project of colonialism that was going on at the time. And the disease that wiped out Tisquantum's community, the Patuxet tribe of the Wampanoag people, is theorized to have been brought over by colonizers as well. While Tisquantum helping people in need is a lovely thing, to ignore the context in which it happened, centering it entirely on a man deciding to do something good, erases the circumstances and the many people who made decisions that created those circumstances. The story of Tisquantum is being manipulated into a generic story about not giving in to despair, one of personal triumph while ignoring the tragedies happening around him. The story doesn't even really make sense. It says that the people who were living on that land were all killed by a disease, and Tisquantum, I guess, lived there by himself until the settlers arrived, except it also mentions other people apparently wanted to help but couldn't speak the language. Who were these people if all the people who had been living there had been wiped out? And what did they think about all these people settling on this land? It's clear by the details that are ignored that this narrative is serving a very specific reading of history. If you look more into the history of Tisquantum as a historical figure, it isn't surprising to learn that his story comes entirely from the perspective of settlers. And the version of the story we get in Chasing Embers bears a striking resemblance to religiously themed ones that emphasize the role of Providence guiding Tisquantum towards his ultimate purpose of helping the settlers colonize the land of his people. This selective reading of history is one where a man's story is only understood through the words of settlers, twisting a crime into a fable. This video doesn't have the space to go into the various stereotypes of the noble savage and other characters used to whitewash the brutal history of colonialism, but this particular version presents the story not of people deciding to steal land and commit atrocities, but rather a series of people acting in accordance with Providence. It centers history around individual figures while simultaneously taking away their agency, a theme of Chasing Embers. Going back to the book, the whole story of Tisquantum is part of Amos trying to convince Sky that even though he's been dealt a rough hand, he can still do some good. Of course, the story doesn't really map onto Sky at all because we don't know what Sky's secret past is, but he's presented as being analogous to Tisquantum as it's all according to some divine plan. Ember, on the other hand, is immediately charmed by the people of Cherry Harbor because their wholesome vibes are just so overwhelming. Although in Ember's case, these people reminding her of her parents would at least make sense. And as the reader, we're just sort of sat there waiting for Ember to join along Sky with the people of Cherry Harbor. But instead of having to go through that whole thing again, the book pushes things forward as the mysterious man, who is obviously Ember's father, suddenly appears and Ember finds out who he is. We finally get a bit of backstory about what's going on here, and the brief version is that the Topos Corporation was given the country bit by bit until it had taken over America, and now they want to create a new world by emptying the minds of people so they can be controlled. Ember's father, Adam, explains how he and his wife went to Oasis to safely raise a family, but the price was he had to work at a lab controlled by Topos, developing some horrible technology that would let them implant dreams into people, which somehow makes them easier to control. Of course, it's ridiculous science, but I think that's actually fine. Books don't always have to explain every scientific detail. Adam eventually bails on the project and joins up with the Oarsmen to fight back. Apparently, the Oarsmen have a secret weapon that will stop Topos in their secret armory, but no one knows where that is because it's hidden in a map that was in the book Adam gave to Ember in the prologue, the book that was confiscated and is now possessed by Topos in Oasis. It's also revealed that the Oarsmen were betrayed by a spy, which is why they all got arrested, although the whole spy plotline seems like it's something for a future book. We get a tiny glimpse of Sky's backstory during all of this when he reacts very pointedly when the name Azaz Ilo comes up. If you guessed she's his mother, like I did, you might be wrong, or right. The book kind of hints at that, but we're not there yet. After this very big exposition dump, the T-Force arrives. The T-Force are Topos' goons, and they start fighting with the residents of Cherry Harbor. Turns out there was a tracking device in Henry's pocket the whole time, which you'd think Ember would have known about because she was the one who put it there. I guess she forgot to check in their rush to escape Oasis, but I'm sure she'll never make the mistake of accidentally having a tracking device on her again. This giant action sequence is very messy, but this is a good opportunity to talk about how this book is written and its unusual style. There's a moment where, in the midst of all this fighting, Sky is wondering which side to join in after a new character, Commander Daly, leader of the T-Force, accuses Sky of being a traitor. Here's what the narration was like. Despite the adrenaline flowing through me, I felt like I was trudging through mud as I replayed in my mind what the commander had said. Is he right? Did I pick a side? As the doors to the sticking place opened, I wondered what side I had been on before. And who's on my side now? Without meaning to, had I joined some kind of rebellion? Then I remembered Mr. Amos's words. A special life prepares you for something special. That's your life, Sky. But what was it? Was it really? Who am I? Tastes will, of course, vary, but this kind of writing really annoys me. The over and inconsistent use of italics, the same question being asked repeatedly, the single-sentence paragraphs that emphasize every moment. While there is some reality to presenting a mind as a series of cluttered thoughts, it's part of what makes the POV characters so annoying to follow. It reflects their confusion, yes, but it also confuses the narrative. We can understand moment to moment what's happening in each chapter, but the greater story is often obscured because the characters' thoughts are so cluttered and disorganized. Our characters aren't really ignorant of facts, they simply don't think of them. They perpetually exist in each moment, stressing each twist of fate. But since these characters don't place their lives in a greater context, it doesn't feel nearly as powerful as it tries to be. It just creates a gap between the reader and the characters, making them tougher to empathize with. It can basically be understood as a flat plot hiding behind a messy style of writing. One thing that is interesting, though, is when Sky and Ember appear in each other's chapters. When Sky is narrating, Ember seems a lot more competent and interesting, and the reverse is true when Ember is narrating. It's almost as if looking into the minds of these characters was a huge mistake. It's around here we also learn what Sky's real name is, and it's Trotsky. That was the eye-rolling name I warned you about. Even though we know his name is Trotsky, he still goes by Sky through most of the book. Sky hides with Ember and Adam while the fighting is going on, but they overhear Amos and Lincoln being captured by the goons. Just those two, though, because we later find out everyone else at Cherry Harbor escaped somehow. The T-Force had guns that fired teal lady injections that knocked people out, but I guess it didn't really compare to some guys with shovels. With Lincoln and Amos captured and the book with the map to the armory in Topos' hands, Ember, Sky, and Adam decide to go back to Oasis to free their friends and get the map. As they head to Oasis, Ember joins the Oarsmen, and we find out that Oarsmen is actually an acronym. Brace yourself for this one. Outside of Oasis, are people the same as us? Regardless, we are the same as them. Silly question. Men are all the same, I think. Equal, yes. Naturally. This is the spoken code that Oarsmen use to communicate with one another. And what this suggests is that the whole Oarsmen movement is centered around this one town of Oasis. I kind of wonder what happened to the rest of America if it's all just gripped in war and there's just this one town that exists, but I guess that's a detail for a future book. If it seems like Ember has gone from Oasis goon to Oarsmen hero really quickly, that's because she did. Her inner journey seems to be motivated by her desire for parental approval, the phony approval of Azaz and then the real approval of her father. The values of Oasis and the Oarsmen don't really matter as much to her. It makes her an odd hero for the book, whose ethos is framed by whether her parent figure is good or bad. That she can only tell the two apart when her little brother is being drugged and taken away really speaks to how poorly formed her moral framework is. And when she immediately joins the Oarsmen, only knowing that her father is one of them, it makes it seem like she's just swapping one master for another, and not stopping to consider what she believes in, and why she would fight for anything. Also, it's at this point a romance with Skye is hinted at, though it didn't really make much sense. Although Skye does save Ember's life when T-Force attacks Cherry Harbor, before that, they actually didn't seem to get along at all. He, like a complete dope, was trash-talking her dad, and she kind of snaps on him and walks off. But after he rescues her, she, I guess, thinks he's cute. It's this very creepy, old-fashioned idea where if a guy rescues a girl, she just falls for him, adhering to this very tired damsel in distress cliche. This romance also makes me think this is why the characters had to be 16 and 17, because I think it would hit a little different if they were both kids. When the trio get to Building 1, where the prisoners and Mapped are kept, they decide to split up. And it's kind of funny that Ember notes that they don't really have a plan in her narration. They're just kind of vibing with this whole experience, almost as if the story couldn't be bothered to explain why the next few chapters play out the way they do. Here's some of Ember thinking about leaving Cherry Harbor to go back to Oasis. I walked on with the exact same sense of dread that had been growing in me since we'd made our plan to leave. That was the only part we'd made, the leaving part. Everything beyond that point was unnervingly unclear. The group leaves everything to fate, or more accurately, they leave it to Providence. The theme of Providence comes up many times in these later chapters, and it very much seems to be guiding all of these characters. At one point, when Ember and her father are sneaking into a lab as they hunt around for the map, one of the test subjects for the dream mind control experiments gets in their way. He's experiencing some kind of hallucination where he's fighting someone, and Ember thinks, I have no idea why, but for some reason, I decided to encourage him. It was the only thing I could think of to do. Of course, this plan that just suddenly comes to her mind works, and the guy decides to step aside and also type in the code to the restricted area. I don't know why he had that code either, but I guess it's just another example of the hand of Providence that's guiding all of this. This book obviously has very religious undertones, and being guided by the hand of God is something that comes up in a lot of religious work. Although, personally, I always wonder what this divine force of Providence was doing when the entire country was taken over by an evil corporation, but that sort of thinking isn't really explored in this book. I guess the divine hand of Providence has a light touch. Skye searches for Lincoln and Amos alone. While walking through Building 1, he runs into a friend we've never heard of before named Ian. This is the son of Commander Daly, or as he's introduced to us reading the book, I.P. Daly. This is where I started to suspect the writer was messing with us, that this whole book was an elaborate joke meant to earn some quick money out of Glenn Beck's pocket. If this is the case, I have a lot of respect for this writer. Ian isn't too important to the story, aside from providing some exposition confirming that Skye was once in T-Force, which is a bit weird because there's this earlier chapter in the book where he's really physically unfit and being shown up by the 12-year-old Lincoln at this big games festival. But it does fall in line with the whole idea of T-Force being filled with a bunch of unfit losers who are easily beaten up by random guys with shovels and 16-year-old girls. There's also a moment where Sky makes this really important choice that he's going to believe in the stories Amos was telling him. Is presented as a really grand moment, but really just feels like it was in there for the next book, as we see Sky's development in the next section. When Sky finds Amos and Lincoln, he manages to free them by wearing a special hat that's also a key to the doors in Building 1. And that's not a joke. One of the technologies in this future is you have to wear a special hat to go through doors. IP Daily says they're a new idea, so I guess the people of Oasis haven't figured out that wearing a hat as a key is really ridiculous, because it's very easy to steal a hat off of someone's head. Not that it really matters, because Sky, Lincoln, and Amos are captured immediately. Azaz threatens to kill either Lincoln or Amos if Sky doesn't go back to working for Topos. After getting the Forbidden Book, Ember and her dad find Sky on his own, only to later find out that he's betrayed them and back to working with Topos. Under Azaz's instructions, Sky injects Aaron with T.R.U.E, not realizing this will kill Aaron as he's already gotten a dose, and I guess 2 doses kill a person. Ember grabs the book with the map and runs out of the building with Lincoln and Amos, leaving the traitorous Sky behind. If you were wondering if there's like a thrilling escape scene, no, she just runs, and that's it. They're gone. Aaron's death was telegraphed a few chapters before it actually happened, with this bit of irony where he entrusts Ember to Sky, having a man-to-man talk. I think this is also meant to foreshadow an impending romance. It's all very heavy-handed and obvious. What's weird, though, is Aaron is constantly coughing and falling over and on death's door when we first meet him in his sudden appearance at Cherry Harbor. But as the book progresses, he seems to be filled with all this energy and resilience. The book even makes note of this. Even though he's been imprisoned for 7 years and is living non-borrowed time, basically, he's being filled with a renewed sense of energy as we approach the chapter where he dies. The book even notice it's like he's being guided by Providence. Because, of course, characters can't do anything in this book unless Providence wills it to be so. It really makes these characters feel like they're puppets for divine intervention. This is a type of Deus Ex Machina, although not in the literal sense of a being showing up to fix everyone's problems. Rather, character motivations and actions are not their own, or at least can't be expressed on their own. Rather, they are the works of some kind of divine will or force. I almost wish the book would just be more honest about what it is, that it's a very Christian book trying to present a religious vision of a dystopic future, obviously from a very American Christian perspective. But I think the trappings of more generic young adult fiction are being used as a cloak of some sorts to get these ideas across. It's part of what makes this book deceptive. The final chapter of this book has Ember waking up at the Outpost. The Outpost is where all the residents of Cherry Harbor ran off to, and it was referenced earlier in the book, but it seemed like a very small place. I don't know how this entire community managed to get there with only 2 members being captured, but nonetheless, that's where they are. We don't even really get details on how Ember got from Oasis to there. She just kind of wakes up there. We find out a few more things, such as the map is only a quarter of the map, so we're probably going to need another 3 books to find the other 3 quarters. Also, Ember's brother Henry is fine now, in case you were worried. He only got a partial injection of T.R.U.E, so he recovered. Ember has sworn to take up her father's cause, but as I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure where this conviction is coming from, aside from doing her duty to her father, much in the way Christians might be commanded to do their duty to the Father above. This is not a subtle book. What's kind of disappointing as someone who personally loves classic literature, these sort of religious themes are not exactly uncommon. And I don't think it's impossible to write a book like this in the present day that references those themes. It only has to be done well, and this book just is not that well done. Speaking of things that are not well done, it also has an epilogue. We go back to Sky, who is back in Oasis. And it turns out my earlier guess of being Azaz's son was kind of maybe right. It's hard to really be sure because we find out Sky is related to someone important. He's the administrator's grandson. And Azaz is presented as sort of an adopted daughter of the administrator. So I don't know if there's any sort of biological connection between her and Sky, but there's definitely sort of a family dynamic here where the administrator is the grandfather, Azaz is the mother, and Sky is the son. And the fact that they're not biologically related creates this weird subtext that they're the bad guys, whereas the biological connections, such as between Ember and her father, represent a good relationship. The book ends with Sky being promoted to Azaz's old job, and now Azaz has to go hunt down the Oarsmen. So Skye is basically being set up to be Darth Vader. And if you're wondering how Azaz will find the Oarsmen, it's because she let Ember get away and she stuck a tracking device in the book. So I certainly hope the next book starts with Ember thinking to herself, hey, remember how they tracked us down last time with the tracking device? Maybe we should check ourselves for one of those again. Or maybe they'll be found out in the exact same way they were in the first book. And so ended Chasing Embers, the first book in the Oarsmen series. But before we close the cover on this book, and I offer my own closing thoughts, there was a note from Glenn Beck in the final few pages that I just have to read. Here's how it starts. I have had this series in my head forever. I first thought of it, surprisingly, while reading Karl Marx. I thought to myself, the only reason he is so popular is because it's cool to be different. It's exciting to adopt an idea that feels forbidden. We like to travel beyond the no trespassing signs of our society. If that's the case, then when will the writings of brilliant men such as Thomas Jefferson become cool? When you can't read them anymore. I honestly can't follow the logic of any of that, because presumably the writings of Marx are also forbidden in this series, since books aren't allowed, period. Also, the works of Marx today aren't forbidden. They're actually really easy to find in libraries and bookstores around the world. Honestly, I'm more surprised that he read Marx at all. And it's very funny that he's presenting this idea of books being banned as some original idea. Maybe he should pick up a copy of Fahrenheit 451, or maybe continue pretending as if he's never heard of it. Speaking of not being aware of similar books, the title Chasing Embers has actually been used several times in the past. I found 4 other books on Amazon with the exact same title, and maybe they should give some thought to what they name their book so it doesn't get confused with these 3 steamy romance novels of the same name. But I've saved the most shocking revelation for you all here at the end of the video. I did not hate this book. Now, I'm not saying I thought it was entertaining, insightful, or even particularly good. What I enjoyed about reading this book is that it annoyed me enough to activate my mind into a kind of resistance, to deconstruct its weird ideology and take some time to learn some of the actual history it presents. And I enjoy books that get me thinking. Now, please don't confuse this video as some kind of recommendation to read this book. Please don't waste your time or money on this thing. But I hope it made a good subject for a fun video because it was kind of fun to go through all of this. It offers a glimpse into the religious conservative worldview that you don't get from their commentary alone. A world where providence and weaponized history is used to guide an agenda. For all the complaints about LGBT or racially diverse books brainwashing kids, we get this novel designed to try and get kids into Christian conservatism. The plot literally involves 2 teens being recruited, one succeeding and one failing, into a revival movement that blends Christianity with American nationalism. It reveals that the battle for the minds of the young is one that conservatives participate in all the time, but luckily for us, their books aren't very good. The big challenge of working on this video has been the fact that I am hurt. I had a bit of a fall a few days ago when I was out for a run and I landed flat on my face on the sidewalk after I tripped over something. And while I am going to be fine, at the moment I have a ton of bandages on me and a very sore rib. So if I sound a bit off in this video, it's because I am playing through the pain and trying to give you all a fun little video about a terrible little book. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more of it in the future, consider becoming like the lovely people you see on your screen right now with their names scrolling up the screen. These are the patrons and channel members who help make stuff like this happen. In addition to getting their name in the credits, they get early access to videos and the occasional fun extras I throw in every now and again. If you would like to support me in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and share the video on social media. And finally, thank you all so much for watching.